The Secretary and Correspondent, Reverend Dr. Boniface Jayaraj S.A., the Principal of Loyola College, Reverend Dr. Louis Arokkiraj S.A., the Head of the Department of Economics, Dr. M. Selvaraj, the President of LEAD, Dr. R. Sarita, the many faculty members of the Department of Economics, and the truly blessed and lucky students who are enrolled in this outstanding institution that has now reached 100 years of excellence in the field of economics. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to this inauguration of the lecture series, the centenary lecture series. And I hope that despite the time being roughly around lunchtime, I won't hold you for very long, but have something of value to say. I must confess that I was joking with the principal when he said, this has been a momentous week for us because we had the chief minister here, we had the sports minister here. So I said, you've been going downhill since then because you got the head of the government, then you got a senior minister, then you got me. And in some ways, I think the centenary lecture series also is starting at the bottom, at the floor. I'm going to set the floor in the sense that though many have called me an economist, I must confess that my undergraduate degree was in chemical engineering, my master's degree was in operations research, my PhD was in applied psychology, and my MBA finally was in finance, but I didn't take a course in economics till I was 33 years old. So I'm not sure I'm qualified to speak a lot about economics. But I will start by first just trying to fathom the great legacy of this institution. Very few institutions last 100 years. It takes decades to build an ecosystem, to build a culture, to build a standard of excellence. And I know so many graduates of not just Loyola College, but economics graduates of Loyola College who have gone on to have stellar careers in banking, in regulation, in corporates. So I know that this college is second to none anywhere in the world. And I first start by congratulating all of you who have the great privilege of 100 years of wonderful tradition ahead of you, and you get to benefit from that during your time here. In Oxford University, which is one of the oldest universities in the world, the study of economics is usually through a subject or a discipline called PPE. It's called politics, philosophy, and economics. There's an understanding that philosophy, the science of how humans interact as a society, what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad, what is fair, what is just, that economics is just the application of philosophy to those things that relate to money, progress, development, distribution. And so some would argue that economics is nothing but philosophy related to money and munificence. And in fact, in most parts of the world, politics is driven by a variation in economic outlook. Most parts of the world, politics is between what they call the left and what they call the right. The left being more towards the nature of socialism or communism, and the right being more towards the nature of unbridled capitalism at its extremes. So in that sense, the true impact of economics is felt every day in every life by the policies set by those people who are elected in a democracy. In fact, I've spoken in many places around the world about two recurring themes that I observe. The first is that democracy and free markets or market-based socialism or capitalism, some version of anything other than the state owns all the assets and decides who gets to have what. Any other organization of society is only viable if you have a democracy. You must have the right to vote universally given to people, and that right to be exercised on a regular basis. And that has to be both the supporter of a free market, of capitalism, of market based socialism, as well as the regulator of unbridled capitalism or market based socialism. In the natural course of events, every free market model will lead to such outliers in terms of winners, such great concentration of wealth, that they will effectively be able to subvert the system, and you will find the bulk of citizens are no longer vested in the continuation of this market-based system. That has been the tendency from inception. It has come and gone in waves. And the notion of democracy, the notion of one person, one vote, irrespective of your wealth, irrespective of your education, irrespective of your location or status, is that such a system is supposed to force the government, the elected politicians, to take policy decisions that are for the greater good, for the many, for the distribution of resources, for ensuring that no one gets left behind. That is what the voting model is supposed to do. It is supposed to be the antidote to unbridled concentration of wealth and a huge separation in society between the haves and the have-nots. This is not a new concept. It has been talked about and written about for decades. But the second phenomenon that I observe around the world today is that there is a general decline or a cyclical downturn in the quality of democracy in the fabric of our societies. This is true not just in developing countries like India or some parts of Asia and Africa. It is 100% true in fully developed countries like the United States or the United Kingdom or large parts of Europe. And I have argued that economically speaking and structurally speaking, this deficiency of democracy has three core components. And if we want to improve the quality of our democracy, if we want to improve the quality of citizens' faith in a model that still allows for voting and election of officials, we have to fix these three core deficiencies. Biggest driver of development in the last 4 or 5 decades has been increasing globalization. Now, globalization is not a new phenomenon. For those of you who study history, or those of you who look at different kinds of even fictional narratives, throughout history there have been periods where the world has been united under one model which allows for expropriation of resources, which allows for transfer of assets. Perhaps the earliest that we can think about is the great Roman Empire. At one point, the Roman Empire stretched across the world, and the rule of one set of people living in one small part of Italy basically drove the outcomes of the rest of all human beings in the world practically. This era of globalization, because the Romans owned the whole globe, has many historical artifacts left behind. For those of you who travel, you can see great Roman monuments in places like the Middle East, in the UK, in other parts of the world. Not in the New World, because they didn't have seafaring technology to reach Australia or the United States. The second big era of globalization was the era of colonialism, where those with naval power, those with great armies, those with resources, effectively tried to integrate all of the lands under their control. There was a great British Empire, the French had colonies, the Germans had colonies, even the Americans had colonies around the world. And at some level, the movement of goods, of capital, of people to a limited extent across these geographies was an era of globalization. Every single era of globalization, of removal of barriers, of removal of friction, will automatically accelerate the overall growth of the world. This is a mathematically provable concept. Every time you remove any barriers to trade, you remove friction costs like import duties or import constraints or export constraints, you will find the global output goes up a lot. But what you will almost always find is that disparity will increase at the same time. Not so much disparity between nations, but disparity within nations. Within India, you will find the rich are getting faster, much richer, and the poor are not. You will find that's true in the United States, you will find that's true in China. So, this era of globalization that has now run about 30 or 40 years is very unique. In the history of the world, we have never had this kind of hyper globalization where there's not just movement of goods, of capital, of human beings, but movements of information, of services across wires, transfer of knowledge, transfer of wealth that is happening remotely across the internet. And so, what we have in the last few decades is the era of hyper globalization. Some could argue that now the amount of backlash against such globalization is leading to a secular decline, or in some sense, a reversal of the last cycle. But the last cycle has left us with these three great problems, three great reasons why democracy is in deficit or in recession around the world. The first is the gap between the haves and the have nots has increased exponentially. I can talk about this around the world. I can talk about how the rich and poor have separated in America or in the United Kingdom or in Europe or in Africa. But in India, the benchmark, which I think is the most startling benchmark, is that the top 1% of the people in this country own something like 50 or 60% of the country's wealth. What is worse, the concentration of wealth and income in India today is worse than it was under the British Raj in 1920. Think about that. What is the point of democracy? What is the point of people elected rule? What is the point of independence if, on average, the gap between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have nots, is worse than it was under a colonial power? That to me is one of the biggest failures of democracy, why a lot of people are disgruntled, why a lot of people have lost faith in the system. The second big problem is that most governments have not kept up with the administrative model or platform or technology required to function effectively as a government. And that's true not just for Tamil Nadu, it's not true for India alone, it's true even for rich countries that have relatively high resources. Part of the problem is that if you're in a competitive position in the market, you're a developer of software, or you're a bank, or you're a maker of soft drinks, or you're a logistics company, whatever field you're in, you are in a competitive market. Some could argue it's a lot less competitive today because we've ended up with mega corporations through mergers and acquisitions, that the entire market for some food products, for example, is down to 4 companies in the whole world. What used to be 400 companies 20 years ago has now been merged into 4 major companies. And yet it is still a competitive market because each of these 4 companies is like a superpower in itself and they're constantly battling each other. So if you are in a competitive market, it is imperative that you develop efficiency, productivity, branding, marketing, customer satisfaction. You have to keep up at the cutting edge or you will lose market share, you will lose profitability, you will lose shareholder value, and you'll get thrown out of your job if you're the executive. Compare that to governments. Every government, by definition, is a monopoly. There can be only one government of Tamil Nadu. There can be only one government of India. Different people come and go when the elections give different results. But because it is either you or nobody else, there has not been that kind of urge to transform the way government works. And I say this again, I've said it in different roles as an opposition member, as a finance minister, as a technology minister. Every single government is woefully understaffed, and the IT systems and platforms and continuity models of the organization are very, very, very inadequate. The government of Tamil Nadu's vacancy rate between sanctioned posts and actual employees is somewhere around 40%. Think about that. For every 10 government jobs is supposed to be, only 6 of them are filled. That's about the same across every state in India. That's about the same for the government of India, Union Government of India. In fact, we cannot do much better, nor do we have the systems to actually fill these jobs that rapidly, and we cannot afford it because even now, the state spends so much of its money on pensions and salaries for government employees and perpetuating the benefits for government staff and government departments. So you have this problem where governments are not able to deliver services equitably with reasonable access to citizens, and therefore citizens' faith in the quality of governance, in the nature of the administration is failing, and you're starting to see all kinds of problems in terms of social unrest. That's true in India. It's, by God's grace, it's not so true in Tamil Nadu. But in other states, it's very common. And around the world, we're seeing that. Some of you may have seen the extent of rioting and troubles that have been happening in the United Kingdom in the last few days. That's not atypical of what is happening around the world. The third big failure, or the third big driver of a dissonance or a recession in democracy, is that the nature of society is being disrupted. It is being disrupted by two things. One, technology platforms like social media, which are, as a fellow guest of mine at a seminar in Delhi a few months ago, he called social media the outrage machine. It is engineered to drive outrage. It is engineered to drive extreme emotion, othering of people. You see a video, it shows something, really bad happening, it enrages you, you start posting all kinds of comments on it. And we now have a much more kind of at each other's throats, much more polarized, much more disintegrated notion of community and society. And what makes this worse in a lot of countries around the world is that large-scale immigration has created a structural change in the composition of society. If you take countries which allow immigration or refugees or workers from other places, the face of society has changed. I was in the United States a couple of times last month, unexpectedly. I used to live there from 1987 to 2007. When I went in 1987, it was very rare to see other Indian people on the street, if not in the university that you were in. And even then, Indian students made up a small percentage of the population. If you go to the United States today, in any industry, in medicine, in banking, in the law, in corporates, in CEOs, in board members, in venture capitalists, there's such a huge strength of Indians, many of them Tamils, the luxury of our education, the consequences of their hard work and their success. But in fact, the picture of a boardroom 40 or 50 years ago and the picture of a boardroom today shows different levels of, diversity, different levels of color, different levels of gender. This has exacerbated the first two problems. When you have an increasing spread of rich and poor, when you have a failing delivery of governance, then everybody is looking for a reason, for somebody to blame, for some excuse why this has gone so badly. And xenophobia, anti-immigration, racist tendencies get exacerbated and get really profound. These are, in my view, the three biggest reasons: economic, social, and because of globalization, accelerated and technology, we have seen this kind of deficit or recession in democracy. But I don't want to end on a bad note. I want to say that many of these things are cyclical after all. And the two things that I see sitting in my seat, the first, the recent election results of the national election 2024 have been a clear refutation of one person, one authority, one centralization. And we have seen in places like Uttar Pradesh, the people have taken democracy and the constitution, preserving democracy and preserving the constitution as the biggest driver of voting patterns. So, irrespective of economic status, irrespective of education levels, it is now clear that people are starting to note that a recession in democracy, a decay in your rights, is long-term negative for you. It doesn't matter who the charismatic leader is. You have to protect the one person, one vote, and the role of the Constitution and the rule of law. The second, I would say, is technology. Perhaps it's because I'm sitting in my seat, but it is very clear to me that the way we fix the problem of lack of investment, of lack of equity, of lack of government services being adequate is through the massive application of technology, particularly the new age technology like artificial intelligence, which can eliminate the need to process mundane tasks through human beings. So, an easy fix to fix your 40% vacancy problem is by better digitalization of existing data, by better development of applications, by ensuring online access to all citizens either through their phones or their laptops, or through e-service centers, or through door delivery of services, and therefore eliminating the need for most people to go and see a human being and ask for something from the government. In my time in the IT ministry, we have expanded the e-service centers from under 8,000 to over 25,000. We have expanded the number of things you can apply for and get electronically, including birth certificate, community certificate, first generation graduate certificate, driving license, ration card, almost any document you need from the government, you don't have to go to a government office. In my time in finance, we made it possible for you to get a life certificate for your pensions just sitting at your home and going through Aadhaar identification with the postal bank, India Post Bank. Therefore, you never need to see a human being. It reduces the cost, it reduces the inefficiency, it reduces the subjectiveness of how you get treated when you go to a government office. That is for every citizen. And for the government, it reduces the need for us to build more offices, have more counters, invest in capex, have more employees. So I am of the firm belief that though we see democracy in reasonable distress around the world, we have turned the corner. We see so many signs of hope in so many parts of the world that parties that once seemed invincible, or parties that had super majorities being held accountable by the people, the reassertion of the need for the Constitution and the principles of democracy being the core of people's voting decisions, and the ability to use technology, which so far has really created more problems through social media and polarization and the outrage machine, we can use technology for the good, for continuity, for institutional memory, for automation, for elimination of subjectiveness, and for increasing the equitable delivery of government services and public goods and services to all citizens. I hope that over the course of the year, you will get to see far more technical and enlightened speakers in the field of economics. It is sometimes called the dismal science because it's always projecting bleak outcomes. But as the principal said, it is the core of all our political philosophies that economic development and equitable, socially accessible to all components of our society, economic development is the basis for calling the model of democracy a success. And I'm sure that with all of you, when you finally graduate and go out into the world and add your own impact, many of you as professionals, hopefully some of you in the government, some of you as regulators, some of you as central bankers, that we will get the benefit of the wonderful education that you are receiving in this 100-year institution. I wish all of you a great time while you're here, a wonderful future career. I wish the members of LEAD who are taking office a very successful and impactful year. I congratulate the institution and the department for a century of excellent work, and all the best for the century to come. Thank you very much.